Hi there, Smart Drivers. Rick with Smart Drive Test talking to you today about part two of traffic safety, talking about urban development, urban growth, and growing up with the automobile. Some cities did, some cities didn't. So we're going to talk about that today. Stick around. We'll be right back with that story. Hi there, Smart Drivers. Rick with Smart Drive Test. We are on day 23 of lockdown. Day 24, actually, of story time here on the Smart Drive Test website. Our YouTube channel, rather. I forgot where we are. Ryan is here from Saskatchewan. Katie's here. Corey is here from Manitoba. Eric says it's 65 degrees in Minnesota, Minneapolis, which is about 17 degrees Celsius. And Porto in Portugal. Wheelman is there. And Frederick is here from Denmark, so a few people here already. And yeah, great day here. Damon is here as well. And yes, Damon, I did get your email and I'll respond to you. Yeah, road crashes and why nobody cares. And, it's not just today that people, it's not that people don't care. It's just that it's not higher on their priority list. And I've said this again and again about COVID-19, that we are more likely to die from heart disease, cancer, traffic crashes, the flu, the common flu, and suicide. Those are the top reasons why people die in this day and age. Heart disease is right there at the top. And, there could be all kinds of, we could have a discussion for days about, exercise, about diet, the food that we have in our society. I mean, there's all kinds of documentaries written about that kind of information. So, Carrie's here from Minnesota, and Damon is tuning in from Texas. Awesome. So that's really great. So, one of the things I was talking about the other day, 2 days ago, yesterday I had a couple of questions I wanted to answer, so I spent the day talking about how to find a job and whatnot. One of the things I wanted to talk about was the horse and the buggy, and I talked about the limitations of the horse and how cities were impacted by the horse, and that people think we have this romantic notion of horses in the 19th century and previous to that cities were great places, and there were a few horses around and there weren't any problems. The thing, that's simply not true, right? The horses presented a completely different set of problems. Completely different set of problems. Manure being one of them for the most. Eric, the Spanish flu. Yeah, we could talk about the Spanish flu, Eric, but it's again completely different. There's no comparison to what's happening today as to what was happening with the Spanish flu at the end of the First World War. So yeah, and Janet's here from Ontario, and Matthew is tuning in from Quesnel, BC, and so I just I got a book here, and I want to read a section of the book to you. This is a book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities by Jane Jacobs. If you are going to go to university, you're going to study anything about urban planning, urban development, urban history. Urban history is basically the study of cities and how people interact with cities. Or you're going to do traffic within cities, those types of things. You have to read this book, Jane Jacobs. It's Jane Jacobs. There we go. The Death and Life of Great American Cities, and she is considered one of the. This is one of the pinnacle texts, one of the books that you have to read if you're looking at cities and you're gonna, the history of cities and those types of things. So. Jasmine is here. Hello, my friend. Sheldon, I want parking when driving. Okay, we can answer those questions in a bit here. Anyway, I just want to read this to you because it's interesting about the horse and talking about the horse in London, England, and what it was like at that juncture. So, what street life was like for really big and intense cities and their users in the horse and buggy days has been described by an English architect, the late H.B. Creswell, who wrote for the British Architectural Review of December 1958. A description of London in 1890, so at the end of the 19th century, when he was a young man. And the myth that she's trying to dispel is that the city would be better off without the cars. We wouldn't have all the problems that we have in cities with cars. We wouldn't have traffic crashes. We wouldn't have parking problems. We wouldn't have congestion. We wouldn't have urban pollution because of the exhaust from motor cars and whatnot. So Jacobs is writing this to dispel this myth that with the horse and buggy, there was simply another set of problems, and these are the problems. And this is what Creswell writes about London, England, in the 1890s. He says, the Strand of those days, the Strand is a suburb of London, was the throbbing heart of the people's essential London. Hedged by a maze of continuous alleys and courts, the Strand was fronted by numbers of little restaurants whose windows vaunted exquisite feeding, taverns, dives, oysters and wine bars, hams and beef shops, and small shops marketing a lively variety of curious or workaday things, all in many interests. But the mud and the noise and the smell and these blemishes were the mark of the horse. The whole of London's crowded wheeled traffic, which in parts of the city was at times dense beyond movement, was dependent on the horse, lorry, wagon, bus, hansom, and growler, and coaches and carriages and private vehicles of all kinds were appendages to the horse. Meredith refers to the anticipatory stench of its cab stands on railways approach to London, but the characteristic aroma for the nose recognized London with gay excitement was of stables which were commonly of 3 or 4 stories, which inclined ways zigzagging up the faces of them. Their maidens kept the cast iron filigree chandeliers. There glorified the reception rooms of upper and lower middle class homes throughout London, encrusted with dead flies, and in late summer veiled with jiving clouds of them. So the flies are everywhere, and not only that, in the wintertime they're absolutely, they're dead in the windows and every other flat surface. So the flies because of the manure. A more assertive mark of the horse was the mud that, despite the activities of a numerous corps of red-jacketed boys who dodged among wheels and hooves with pan and brush in service to iron bins at the pavement edge, either flooded the streets with churnings of pea soup that at times collected in pools over brimming the curbs, or at others covered the road surface as with axle grease or brain-laden dust to the distractions of the wayfarer. In the first case, the swift-moving hansom or gig would fling sheets of such soup were not intercepted by trousers or skirts completely across the pavement, so that the frontages of the Strand throughout its length had an 18-inch plinth of mud parge thus imposed upon it. So basically, the manure in the streets, when it got wet, turned out to be pea soup, or in the summertime, when everything dried out, became dust particles and was just this awful dust throughout the streets of London. And then when it was pea soup, what would happen was the wheels of the hansom cabs and the carriages and the wagons and all those things would just slop this on front of building fronts, so that 18 inches to 2 feet up was just this crust of manure and mud and goop on the building fronts. The pea soup condition was met by wheeled mud carts, each attended by 2 laders closed as Icelandic seas in thigh boots, oilskins collared to the chin, and sou'westers sealing in the back of the neck. Sou'westers are, you see those in Newfoundland and in other ocean towns where they're fishing, and they have that hat, the rain hat on that comes out. That's a sou'wester. The foot passenger now gets the mud in his eye. The axle grease condition was met by horses, mechanized brushes, and travelers in small hours found fire hoses washing away residue. So there was huge numbers of people, crews and crews and crews of people, of these boys in red jackets running through the streets, cleaning up horse dung. And then at night, there were crews washing down the streets and trying to, and mechanized street sweepers who were trying to clean up this manure. And after the mud, the noise, which again endowed by the horse, surged like a mighty heartbeat in the central districts of London's life. It was a thing beyond all imagining. The streets of workaday London were uniformly paved in granite sets, and the hammering of multitude of iron-shod, hairy heels upon them, the deafening side drum tattooed of tiered wheels jarring from the apex of one set to the next like sticks dragging along a fence, the creaking and groaning and chirping and rattling of vehicles light and heavy thus maltreated, the jangling of chain harnesses, and the clanging or jingling of every other conceivable thing else, augmented by the shrieking and bellowing called from those of God's creatures who desire to impart information or proffer a request vocally, raised a din that is beyond conception. It was not any such paltry thing as noise. It was an immensity of sound. And so essentially what he's talking about, what he says here is that the streets were paved with cobblestone in London. You have the horseshoes of the horses, which is like pounding on the cobblestone. You have wooden wagon wheels that have a steel band around them. This is going across the cobblestones, so it creates this just din of thunder as the horses are moving up and down the streets. And then, you know, the jangling of the harnesses, and you just, like, you have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of horses, and the sound of the city is completely overwhelming. You know, it's not that idyllic, romantic horse and wagon that we hear in movies, and we see in movies and those types of things, that, you know, the clip clop clip clip clop clip clop clip clop clip clop. You know, that we very much romanticize that. But these cities of the 19th century that were completely dependent on horses were completely and utterly overwhelmed with mud and flies, and just, you know, the sound is overwhelming. So this is what she's talking about, and the point that Jacobs is making here with this excerpt from Creswell is the fact that, you know, the cities had their own problems. And, you know, I would argue as a professional historian studying the motor car that these were the very reasons why the motor car, especially once Henry Ford came along, producing the Model T, you know, and it became affordable. This is why we adopted the motor car so quickly. Despite the fact that the horse had been around for centuries. There were so many benefits. I mean, there wasn't the manure problem, for one thing. And, you know, I mentioned this to you the other day, that, you know, 60,000 gallons of urine and 100,000 pounds of manure on the streets of Manhattan every day in the 19th century that was cleaned off, cleaned away, and dumped into the East River. Raw sewage, right? And as well, Jeffrey Blaney, who's a Australian historian, who's written numerous, like probably 37, 38 books at the last count. You know, one of my favorite lines from, he's writing about Melbourne in the 19th century, Melbourne, Australia, and he says, every building in the city had a privy, you know, had an outdoor toilet in the back that reeked, leaked, and teemed of flies. That was just such a great line. Reeked, leaked, and teemed of flies. So it's not just the manure from the horses in the 19th century, it's also the outdoor toilets. You know, there's no running water, there's no toilets, right? At this juncture, until well into the 20th century, there's no indoor toilets. So it's outdoor privies. All of this sewage is running down the streets. So, you know, it's always kind of fun when I'm talking to my mom, you know, about cities, and, you know, we're reading something historical or we're seeing something historical, and my mom says to me, "Oh, can you imagine?" I spent 5 years at a university doing a graduate degree studying history, and yes, that's what historians do. We imagine. We put together all of the pieces from different historical documents, and then we come up with what it looked like and and this is what it is, right? So, Jonathan, hello, my friend from New York. Okay, we're not talking about that, Damon. We can talk about that another time. Carrie, flies everywhere sounds extremely annoying. Carrie, it was just something else. Damon, third world biohazard, not so much. It was, you know, third worlds, I think I would argue, are probably more challenging because it's horses mixed with mechanized traffic, so it has another set of problems. Eric, nothing like many flies. Seeing those going after piles from horses, mosquitoes are better. I don't know, you know, whether it's mosquitoes or whether it's flies. It's hard to say which one is more gross. Yeah, Carrie, I don't like mosquitoes either. I've been in places in the bush where the mosquitoes will essentially carry you away. I've been in the bush with black flies, and I wouldn't wish black flies on anybody. Black flies are worse. Anybody experienced black flies in Northern Ontario during black fly season, black flies bite you, inject an anesthetic, so you don't feel it until the blood is actually running down your face. Yeah, so black flies are something else. Janet, funny, not something you would think about, but makes sense. London would be a nightmare. Yes, and London was a nightmare, and this is what I was talking to you the other day, Janet, about. There's 8 engineering wonders of the world, and one of those wonders of the world was building the septic system, the sewage system in London to try and reduce disease, because of course you've got all these flies, all these mosquitoes in the cities and towns around the privies and horse manures and those types of things. This is all contributing to disease, right? Disease is polio, measles, mumps, smallpox, cholera. Cholera was just, oh, watch any movie on cholera and it just makes my skin crawl because it's just a really, really awful, terrible way to die. So the motor car comes along, at the beginning of the 20th century, but it doesn't really catch on. It catches on much, much faster in American cities because, as I've mentioned, Henry Ford launched the Model T in 1908. In 1908, it was expensive. It was over $600 for a Model T. So again, it was still in keeping with, the wealthy within society. Most motor cars at the turn of the 20th century cost £1,500 at a time when most working class people were making £5 or £6 a week. Right? Police constables, for example, were making £5 or £6 a week. So the motor car was beyond the, it was only for the wealthy. And then Henry Ford comes along, perfects the assembly line for motor cars. And two things happen with the motor car to be able to make it affordable. First, you de-scale it, right? So before the perfection of the assembly line, as done by Henry Ford, you had an artisan, right? So what they did before the assembly line was they would bring a car in, they would put it up on blocks, and they would build the whole thing. And 2 or 3 people would build it, and they had all of the knowledge about it. And then what happened with assembly lines is that they de-skill it, right? So instead of one person, so let's take a cuckoo clock, for example. So before the assembly line, you had an artisan who would make the whole cuckoo clock from start to finish. So once the assembly line comes in, they take it apart, and each person along the assembly line, so you have, say, for example, you have 50 people along the assembly line, and they take it apart, and each person along the assembly line puts one part on it. And by the time it gets to the end of the assembly line, it's completely assembled. But no one person along that assembly line can put the entire clock together. It's called de-skilling. So it's de-skilling of abilities, right? You no longer have artisans and those types of things. So this is what happened with the assembly line with the motor car is that Henry Ford was able to take the motor car, and instead of one person making the whole motor car, you now had 300 or 400 people making a motor car. And it was de-skilling. The other piece that's instrumental in the perfection of the assembly line is centralization of raw materials, right? Metals, rubbers, tires, those types of things. And that was the other thing that Henry Ford was able to do with his plants in Pontiac, Michigan. So by the 1920s, after the First World War, the motor car, the Model T, becomes affordable for most of the population, and particularly for farmers in the United States of America. The Model T breaks down rural isolation for many farmers because not only was the Model T affordable for many people who were working, the Model T was also easily fixed. So people with minimal skills could fix the Model T. And not only that, it's rumored that the Ford Model T would run on anything that was flammable. It would run on moonshine, it would run on kerosene, it would run on diesel fuel, it would run on gasoline, it would run on anything. And not only that, it had a very high center. The axles were very high, and it would go almost any place. It was almost better than any four-wheel drive. So by the 1920s, and when the Model T went out of production in 1927, I believe, it sold for less than, I think it was $275 or whatnot. So the price of it had gone down exponentially and made it very affordable. Not only that, but in the 1920s, you had a secondhand market. So many people could simply pick up a Model T car for less than $20 on a secondhand market. All right. Wheelman, what was the main reason for the implementation of the automatic transmission, especially in Europe? Was it because of driver damage or a good way of gaining lucrative sales? Interesting enough, that's an excellent question, Wheelman. The automatic transmission did not come about until after the end of the Second World War. Up until the end of the Second World War, and interestingly enough about the automatic transmission, it's exactly what you said. It made it easier for people to drive because a lot of people just didn't want to learn how to drive manual transmissions. The other piece of that was that most of the manual transmissions were not synchromesh transmissions well into the 1950s and 1960s. These were crash boxes, right? These are the same thing that what we experience on trucks today when you have to line up road speed, engine speed, and the gear. Those three things have to match. And it was the same thing with these early renditions of manual transmissions in cars. So it made it difficult for them to, for people to learn how to drive these. And this is why the automatic transmission came about until at the end of the Second World War in the late 1940s. But the automatic transmission really didn't catch on. It didn't become, a selling feature, a huge selling feature until the late 1960s, early 1970s, right? So that's an interesting thing. Eric, crank start, Model T, eventually battery start too. Yes, and I mentioned that the other day, Eric, that the electric starter, yes, very much so, changed how automobiles were sold. The first electric start, it was invented by a guy named Kettering. And it was based on the idea of the cash register box, right? That you would push the total button and the cash register would come out. It was the same principle for the car start, the electric start on the motor car, and it was first showed up in 1912 on Chevrolet Cadillac, the Cadillac model. And had huge implications. Both automatic transmissions and electric start had huge implications for women. Not just women, but also men who did not have a lot of physical strength, did not have a lot of physical prowess, who couldn't get out and turn that crank on that motor. Because you needed a lot of strength to be able to turn that crank on that motor and get that motor started with a crank handle on the front of it. And, as I said, the other thing, there was some difficulty in learning how to shift a non-synchromesh transmission. Okay, Colin, my friend, how are you? Affordable Ford. Yeah, equal Ford. Haha. Not so much anymore, but it definitely was in the 1920s, and it was definitely that revolutionized cities, revolutionized transportation, and broke down rural isolation. Because you have to understand, keep in mind, until the 1920s, until the train came along, pardon the pun, until railways, until the motor car, most people who lived on farms lived their whole life, get this, their whole life, never traveling more than 20 miles from their home. And just put that in your head for just a moment. Well into the 1950s and well before the turn of the 20th century, the 1800s into the 1900s, most people who lived on farms did not travel more than 20 miles from their home their whole life. And this is why the baby boomers, who were the first generation in history to grow up with the motor car, they were the first generation as well that their parents and their immediate family was not their influence as they grew into adulthood, because the baby boomers had access to motor cars and therefore they traveled, and their peer group became the most influential group in their life because they were able to get away from homes. Damon, the automatic transmission is an impressive piece of engineering. Still, I feel that it lowers the bar to an unnerving degree. Interesting. I used to feel that way about the automatic transmission too, but the automatic transmission is beginning to come into its own. I mean, it only took 100, almost 80 years, but it's getting there. Okay, so how did motor cars change, and traffic safety? Let's look at traffic safety a little bit. Of course, in the beginning there was absolutely no traffic safety. They were simply building motor cars, putting them on streets, and those types of things. And where traffic safety, where we first see traffic safety beginning to come into its own, is the first thing that changes traffic safety, and the first thing that we look at in terms of order maintenance. Okay, so when we talk about order maintenance, it's a policing term. So when you start studying police within cities, we talk about order maintenance, right? So what is the order within the city? How are we keeping order? How are we keeping people safe? How are we facilitating the movement of pedestrians, traffic, and goods and services within the city? How are we keeping all of that kind of in a in a loose kind of orderly fashion. And the first traffic safety that begins to originate is that motor cars are speeding. Because you need to understand that the horse only travels at 5 or 6 miles an hour. The horse travels at almost the same speed as a person does walking. It doesn't really go much faster. So now you introduce the motor car in the beginning of the 20th century, and now you have speeds of 20, 30 miles an hour. And there was the same kind of thinking and ideas about how crazy speed was with the train at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And there I have one quote from a professor at the beginning of the 19th century in the 1830s when the train comes out, and he says, "Oh, people can't possibly travel at 30 or 40 miles an hour. They will die of asphyxiation." And I can quote that, right? And you have the same thing happening at the beginning of the 20th century when the car begins to be introduced into city streets, whereas until that juncture with the horse and people walking, I mean, people knew that trains could travel at 30 or 40 miles an hour, but they didn't know that bicycles, and now cars could travel at that amount of speed. So what's happening is the wealthy who have motor cars are traveling at 20, 30 miles an hour on the streets, and there is enormous public outrage. Enormous public outrage. People are afraid. They are take COVID-19 right now in terms of people being afraid of how fast motor cars are traveling at 20 or 30 miles an hour in the city streets. It was the same fear, it was the same charge being leveled at bicycles when bicycles made their appearance at the end of the 1880s and into the 1890s. And not only that, bicycles were much more dangerous because they were silent. People couldn't hear them coming. Not like motor cars. Of course, exhaust and those types of things were not really great in the beginning years of the motor car. So people could kind of hear them coming, right? So the first traffic safety that you kind of get is you get a push by the public to implement laws, implement legislation that's going to control the speeds of motor cars. And there is a huge conflict between police and the wealthy, the upper echelon of society. Because as I said, motor cars are very much, they're a plaything of the wealthy within society. Most people can't afford motor cars until well into the 1920s and 1930s and after the Second World War. So police, until the motor car comes along, are really they're policing the working class within society. They're not having anything to do with wealthy people within society, right? And so now this is all beginning to change, and policing changes as a result of that. And so the first initiatives for traffic safety and to try and reduce the number of crashes within society happens in law, and most of this goes to court, and most of this is tested against automobile societies. So the AAA, the Automobile Association of America, the CAA, the Canadian Automobile Association, Vic Roads, it's not called Vic Roads, the Royal Automobile Society of Victoria, so the RCVA, and they take municipal governments to court. They take the government to court and those types of things. And most of the legislation in the world is based on England's legislation, because England implemented a motor car legislation in 1896. That was the first legislation that came out. So most of it after that was based on that and began to try and control the speeds of motor cars. Janet, it bothers me how much road rage is out there lately and the ridiculous accidents. People drive like they are entitled, not privileged, so unnecessary. Runs insurance rates up, but nobody seems to care. And, Janet, that's very much what we're talking about in terms of, I just don't get it, right? And I've been studying this for a very long time, as many of you know. I've been teaching driver education. I've been teaching, to make people safer drivers and those types of things, and we know that on the things that are going to kill us in our society, the risk of things going to kill us, motor cars are up there in terms of 3, right? It's number 3rd on the list. It's behind heart disease and cancer, and then it's traffic crashes. But nobody seems to really understand that. Nobody seems to care. But, on the other hand, We are empowered by motor cars. We get in, we have control, we can drive the car. Most of the time when we speed, we think to ourselves, oh, that's a victimless crime. If I turn contrary to a sign, people view that as a victimless crime. People see it in the same way that they see tax fraud. It's a victimless crime. Nobody got hurt, right? Most of the time, nobody gets hurt. So it's interesting what you're talking about in terms of road rage and those types of things. And, I've read books and whatnot, Janet. Road rage is not new. It's not new. I mean, it can be traced back to Roman days. Road rage is not new. But the attention to road rage is new. And I'll come back to that for just a sec. Epic, like your videos of crash prevention. Speaking of driving a continuously variable transmission such as the ones in the Nissan, they feel different from your normal torque converter automatic. Yes, these continuously variable transmissions that you're talking about, Epic, yeah, they're a very different feel. But, they're working and they're being put in more and more vehicles. Frederick, Ford T was built on license here in Europe, in Copenhagen, Denmark from 1919. When Henry Ford heard about the workers' weekly Friday beer, he forbade it. Yeah, it's interesting, Frederick. There's been a lot of things written about Henry Ford. Henry Ford was a tyrant. He was controlling. He micromanaged people. I mean, micromanaged people to the point where if there was a barn dance and they were calling out and they do that and move to the right and move to the left and those types of things, he was the one calling it out. He was such a control freak. And people talk about that. Stories I've heard about Henry Ford, he would hire somebody, young new executive or whatnot, and they came down, and if their fingernails were dirty, they didn't get hired. It was that simple. Just incredible, control freak and a bit of a tyrant. So, that story does not surprise me at all. Wheelman, the Bullet movie, just amazing. The vehicle controlled by those stunt drivers, superb drifting and professionalism. Absolutely. And Wheelman, this stunt driving and whatnot. The Dukes of Hazzard. If you see the movie, The Dukes of Hazzard, when he's drifting and when the stunt driver's drifting in that roundabout, one of the top stunt people in the world. I mean, now the things that drivers can do with vehicles is just incredible. Eric, speeds in general, all gas, diesel vehicles these days, especially motorcycles. Yeah. Carrie, understand why people are afraid. There are a lot more pedestrians and bikes out now than usual. I think seeing people speeding way more than normal on the roads is scaring people right now. And this is basically what happens, Carrie, when traffic isn't very dense on roadways and those types of things. People are going to speed. And this is what happens, is that we know as traffic safety professionals that the number of crashes increases on roadways when in good traffic conditions, when roads are dry, and weather is conducive to driving it's not overcast. We know that there's less crashes when it's bad weather. There are less crashes. I know that we see all kinds of cars in the ditch and those kinds of things on a snowy day and those types of things. But I used to say when I was driving truck that I used to prefer driving in snowstorms and bad rain and those types of things, because at least the people who had minimal driving skills, they knew to stay home. So yeah. Eric, motorcycles with all high speed accidents happen quite often lately. Still, weather spinning out, hitting cars. Yeah, there's all of that, Eric, for sure. Motorcycles are. It's a different category of road users, and motorcycles are not really something that you can it's difficult to talk about motorcycles. Motorcycle riders are vulnerable road users. They are part of the vulnerable road user group, which are basically pedestrians, cyclists, and riders, motorcycle riders. Those are your vulnerable road users. And of course now we have people on scooters and those types of things, but these are your vulnerable road users. And we know that people on motorcycles, if they're involved in a crash, are 35% more likely to die. And it's because there's no protection, right? Epic, whenever American states and Canadian provincial jurisdictions try to raise speed limits, you think it's a good idea to actually use the 85 percentile. That's what BC did from, BC raised the speed limit to 120. it's when you're talking about speed limits in terms of traffic safety, it's always a difficult question. It's always a difficult question, and we'll just leave it there for today because I don't want to get into traffic speeds and those types of things. It's an easy out for people who don't have a lot of who haven't done a lot of work in terms of traffic safety circles. It's easy for them to say, "Oh, speed limits this, speed limits that, blah blah blah, statistics this and that," and statistics. We don't even send police officers or other people out to examine traffic crashes anymore. So how do we possibly collect traffic statistics around speed limits and those types of things? As I said, I'll leave it there for today. We'll talk more about that tomorrow, and we'll go from there because I'm getting the sign here in the back that I'm about to be pulled off stage. So where's Scout? I'll go get her quick. But as I've said in the past about speeds, is that there's several definitions of speeding, and is one in terms of traffic safety going to be better than another? So is she coming or not?
I have no idea.
Okay. So what did we learn this morning?
We learned it about the weather, that you look at the flags and then you know which way the wind's blowing.
Yeah. What else did we learn? Where does the sun come up?
The sun comes up from the east and it sets from the west.
And why is that important?
It's because then you know which way the wind's blowing.
And you also know which way you're traveling, right?
Yeah.
Because you can find your way home again?
Yeah.
What? That's kind of all melodramatic there, Dragon. What's going on?
I'm tired.
You're tired. Katie, thank you, Rick, for creating this wonderful video and teaching me how to drive safely. I'm not sure. We're starting at the beginning of traffic safety there, Katie. I'm glad that we can help out, though, for sure. Okay, what else did we learn this morning?
We learned about Dad now has a leg that had been sore for about 4 months, and now he got to sleep in the bed for twice.
Yes, my back is a lot better. It still hurts, but it's a lot better. Thanks, Matthew. All the best. Have a great day.
Is he leaving?
Yeah. Wheelman, many people crash due to overconfidence. How many drivers out there know what oversteer is? Yes, definitely. And there's definitely, Wheelman, there's a video here on the channel on oversteering and some of the crashes that occur because people oversteer.
Night, night.
Okay, if you're not going to do anything, you can go. Okay, say bye. Okay. All right. Are you done?
No.
Okay.
Now that Scout is gone, yay, now I can read another page of gross and disgusting things because Scout is not here. Because Scout is not here.
Okay, well, why don't you pick that up for tomorrow and you can...
No, because I'm going to Mom's tomorrow, so I can't do it.
Oh, right.
So I have to do it today. Which one do you want me to do, Daddy?
What are we going to read? What are we reading here? Okay. A yawn is a big hole. Read this one in the gray area here.
This one?
Yeah.
A yawn is a big hole. Are yawns ugly? Face it. Nobody asked you to display your bacteria filthy mouth with its gunk top teeth, pasty tongue, and bits of unstewed food. Okay, if yawns are so disgusting, then explain why 55% of people who see a yawn actually do the same thing within 5 minutes. Yawns have always been a mystery. The ancient Greeks and Mayans thought that a yawn meant your soul was trying to escape and get to heaven. Other cultures believed that yawns might let evil spirits into your body. Animals, humans, even babies in the womb yawn. But we really don't know why. When the brain... Should I read this?
Sure.
When the brain tricks a yawn...
Triggers
a yawn reflex, it could be the nobody's way of...
No, the bodies.
The body's way of taking in more air because the cells need oxygen. Some think that yawns can be explained by evolution. Evolution?
Yep.
Since yawning shows the teeth, it may have been a show of dominance or a don't bother me gesture. Yawns might, when you yawn, you stretch your mouth.
No. Yawns.
Yawns might also be a way to keep the body at the right temperature. When you yawn, you stretch your mouth and often other parts of your body therapy over in your blood central.
Okay.
Then again, maybe we yawn because we are just bored, and it's something to do either way. I think you'll agree that pandiculation.
Pandiculation.
The act of yawning and stretching might look silly when someone else does it, but when you do it, it sure feels good.
Okay.
Wait. Okay.
I want to show my LOL.
And then this is the book page.
There you go.
These are my LOL. This is Super Baby.
Hey. This is weird.
This is what we don't know her name because they named them in the store. She's like an Olympic person that runs a lot.
Yeah. Wheelman, I hope it's going to be sunny because it's Sunday.
And this is one of the most rarest ones to get. Queen Bee. It's one of my favorites. She's like a fashion model. She came with a phone and they're glitter ones. There are ones that aren't glittery and some that are glittery. A lot of the girls have LOLs. I like using them. I play with them a lot.
Scout is a good reader.
Yeah, I am.
All right, let's leave it there for today.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Thanks everybody for watching. Now pick the best answer, not necessarily the right answer. Goodbye.
Okay, and we'll see you tomorrow.
And we'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks everybody. Okay, and click.
Goodbye.